Magnificent group to bring together to talk about the question of religious freedom and violent religious extremism. So let me begin with Dan Philpott. And Dan, and then we'll just come across and talk a little bit about how York has informed this issue and whether you see relationships between religious freedom and violent religious extremism. How do you think about that? How do you talk about it?
Well, I'd like to speak a little bit about Islam, because Islam is often associated with violence and religious violence. And you mentioned that I'm writing a book on religious freedom in Islam, and that's the core of my work as part of this project. So the kind of popular image that Islam is associated with a lack of religious freedom and with violence is, there is a lot of truth to that as an empirical pattern. Islam has a disproportionate low level of religious freedom. If you look at the 47 or so Muslim majority countries, less religious freedom than the rest of the world on average. Also, Islam is, some 90% of the religious terrorist groups are Islamic and is a disproportionate share in religious civil wars. So you find empirically the broad global pattern, both low levels of religious freedom and high levels of religious violence. But I think the picture, though, is a little more complex than to simply say that Islam is, directly responsible for the violence. One of the things I'm finding in my work is that there are two patterns of Islamic countries that lack religious freedom. One is very familiar, religiously repressive countries. This would be like Saudi Arabia and Iran, and pretty straightforwardly Islamist governed, and they do things to foment religious violence. But more surprising to many is also the prevalence of what might be called secular repression, where in Muslim majority countries you have governments that are really modeled on the kind of Western French Revolution style governance, which involves a very heavy management of religion. Again, we can't just equate the West with religious freedom, because there's the whole tradition surrounding the French Revolution, which is then imitated in countries. The standard bearer is Kemal Ataturk's Turkey, which its regime still today is really built around this heavily secularist model. Ataturk had very ambitious plans to kind of remake the soul of Turkey and Turks in a secular kind of Western image. He thought the way of the future was nationalism, science, enlightenment, rationality, and so forth. Nasser followed suit in Egypt in the early 1950s, and then many of the Arab countries are on this model, as well as the Stans, that group of Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and so forth, are all belonging to the secular repressive pattern. And I would argue that both of those patterns of governance tend to promote and foment religious violence. Should I explain how, or should we go on?
Well, let's go through and then come back. And
okay.
I would like you to explain how, but you talked about both secular and more religion-oriented forms of repression. I think it's important that we follow up on this aspect of Muslim-majority countries, which of course we're aware. And I particularly like a little bit of French bashing. As part of every panel, we try to do that. We certainly want to do. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. Professor Inboden.
All right. I want to start taking up this question from I guess, the vantage point of recent history, drawing a little bit on my background as a scholar, but especially my status as a recovering policymaker, I suppose we could say. So I joined the State Department shortly after September 11th, actually working with Tom in the Religious Freedom Office, and then from there went over to the National Security Council and was able to work on this collection of issues, religious freedom, human rights, counterterrorism, counter-radicalization from a number of vantage points. And we just passed, of course, the 15th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And if you were to have told me shortly after the 9/11 attacks that we'd be sitting here 15 years later with three realities, I would have been surprised at these three realities. So what are the three things that I have been surprised about in the 15 years since? The first, which really needs to be said, is that the United States has not been attacked again on a large scale, another large mass casualty attack since 9/11. Many of us here in the room, many of you here in the room were here in Washington that day, or perhaps New York, as was I. And you remember the environment in the weeks and months after the attacks. I mean, it was just sheer terror. And we didn't wonder if we were going to get hit again. We wondered when we were going to get hit again. And the fact that 15 years later that hasn't happened is notable. And I think any discussion about fighting terrorism and the ongoing threat needs to begin with that fact. I think it's certainly a tribute to the Bush administration and the Obama administration, both of whom have had very vigorous counterterror policies. But the second surprise for me about a reality 15 years later after 9/11 is that today there is this proliferation of violent jihadist groups. I know the terminology and lexicon itself is problematic, and we could talk about there's no perfect way of describing it, but I'll use that as a placeholder right now. After 9/11, it's really just core Al-Qaeda, but now we've got the Islamic State, you've got Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, you've got Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, you've got Boko Haram, you've got Al-Shabaab, any number of others. This whole menagerie of jihadist groups that have proliferated, showing us that the threat is still out there, and that the appeal of this particular ideology and the movement to terrorist action that it inspires, the threat is still very real. So that also would have been a surprise to me. And then the third surprise would have been that 15 years after 9/11, the United States as a government, and even perhaps as a country, would still not have an effective counter-radicalization policy and not have an effective set of instruments to prevent further radicalization. And that is actually a religious freedom problem. And that, I think the very fact that it's a surprise to even call it a religious freedom problem shows how impoverished our thinking still is on this. Tom, if I recall, what made your hair go gray and made me go bald was, our first couple years there in the Earth office, trying to put some of these concepts in 2003 and 2004 and some of the early international religious freedom reports, talking about this is not just a boutique, feel-good, human rights, humanitarian issue of helping a few prisoners of conscience around the world. Rather, this is a strategic imperative to promote religious freedom, to promote religious pluralism and tolerance as antidotes to violent extremism, militant Islam, whatever we want to call it. And the fact that we haven't made more headway since those very early days of even trying to introduce those concepts into our government is really discouraging. And we still haven't cracked the code on how and why a very tiny percentage of the world's Muslims, and that really needs to be remembered. That's why some of the rhetoric out there blaming treating Islam itself as a problem, I fiercely reject. Islam in a lot of ways is going to be the solution to this. The fact remains that a tiny but still very troubling percentage of the world's Muslims, or converts to Islam for that matter, are being radicalized, are seeking to take up arms and harm women and children and other innocent civilians, and blow themselves up in the process. And the fact that we have not made more progress on that is very, very troubling. And we can talk in the discussion about why I think that is a religious freedom problem, but I think that is, acknowledging that is the problem is the beginning to wisdom in tackling it.
Great, thank you, Will. We'll come back to exactly the point you were talking about, which I think is at the core of what we want to get at today. So, Professor Hertzke.
Well, for at least a couple of decades, I have sort of immersed myself, both as a scholar and as a participant and observer, in the sort of the world of religious freedom and advocacy and persecution and so forth. As a social scientist, what I find striking is that I think we are at an historic moment in which the sort of philosophical and normative claims, philosophers and thinkers and religious leaders for centuries about why religious freedom, conscience rights, freedom to follow your transcendent duties is inherently a good thing, is now actually being corroborated by massive social science research. And one of the key findings, Will Inboden's research, Laissez, a number of other people involved in the Religious Freedom Project, is there's a powerful causal relationship documented with global data, sophisticated methodologists, corroborated in numerous ways, of a link between religiously repressive societies and states and religious violence, civil wars, religious terrorism, interstate conflicts. It's one of the most powerful relationships I think I've seen in the social sciences. It's almost nomethetical or law-like like a law of physics.